It should have never happened. I will have that war settled between Putin and Zelensky as president-elect before I take office on January 20th. I'll have that war settled. I think the Middle East will be in a good place. I think actually more difficult is going to be the Russia-Ukraine situation. I see that as more difficult. It's farmland, and it's very, very flat. And the only thing that stops a bullet is the human body. And the human body is stopping a lot of bullets.
Within the first 3 to 6
I hope to have 6 months. No, I would think, I hope long before 6 months.
You saw in that clip there I guess the progress of Trump and his mentality. First of all, he's going to have this solved in 24 hours. And then it was actually, well, I'm going to have it solved before I even get into office. And then it was well, it's a little harder than I thought. And now it's 3 to 6 months maybe, and hopefully before 6 months. I think as the reality starts to appear more to President Trump, he realizes that this is going to be a more difficult situation. How do you read, Doug? And by the way, let me welcome back Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran. First of all, Doug, just welcome to the show. I don't think we've had you on yet in 2025.
No. Happy New Year to everyone.
Yes, and certainly grateful to have you on here. And we're especially despite your, or even in addition to your normal high qualifications for all these stuff, you for a period of time worked for Trump at the end of his first term. So you kind of have a window of how he may think. And I just wonder what your thoughts are when you see this progression from his initial conversation about 24 hours to now 3 to 6 months.
Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, I think he's misguided in thinking that the problems in the Middle East will ultimately solve themselves more quickly than what's happening in Eastern Europe. I think he's apt to be very disappointed on that front as well. In fact, I think it may be infinitely more difficult. As far as understanding President Trump, you need to understand the people around him. And if you look at the people that he surrounds himself with and listens to, it's not surprising that he would have made any of those comments. I can't think right off the top of my head about anyone who may be more uninformed about reality in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia than Keith Kellogg or his sidekick, Fred Fleitz. And it seems that those two had presented a way ahead that Trump eagerly accepted. And if you look at some of his, X's or tweets, whatever we call them now, he adopted all of the utterly false, inaccurate numbers for casualties that have been, proselytized by the CIA, MI6, and the supporters of perpetual war against Russia. So I think from the very beginning, he was starting from a base of knowledge that was frankly inaccurate. So it's not surprising he said that. Now, as far as what can he do, I think increasingly the answer is almost nothing to profoundly influence events on the ground in Ukraine. The one thing he should do is that he should say, look, I didn't start this war. This is not my war. I want to end it as quickly as possible, and I'm announcing an immediate suspension of all military aid to Ukraine. In addition to this, I am ordering all U.S. personnel in or out of uniform, military intelligence, technical advisors, everything out of Ukraine. If he did those two things, the war would stop. That's what needs to be understood, because the Ukrainians obviously couldn't continue, and I'm sure Mr. Zelensky would be either in his wife's Bugatti or in their private jet flying off to Italy or somewhere else to spend their ill-gotten gains. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in cash that they've stolen in the course of this war from the United States and its allies.
Yeah, you mentioned Keith Kellogg there. Even he has kind of changed his tune a little bit the closer we get to Inauguration Day. Here he was on Fox News a couple of days ago talking about how he wants a fair deal.
I really do have a lot of confidence in his ability to actually get to a position where this war is actually over. And I think what people need to understand, he's not trying to give something to Putin or to the Russians. He's actually trying to save Ukraine and save their sovereignty. And he's going to make sure that it's equitable and that it's fair. We'll set the conditions for the president, and then he'll eventually get to a position where he'll be talking to President Putin and also President Zelensky as well. And I think they're going to come to a solvable solution in the near term. And when I say by the near term, I would like to set a goal on a personal level and professional level. I would say let's set it at 100 days and move our way back.
So if he doesn't do what you suggested, Trump, at Kellogg's insistence, which is, all right, we're going to stop immediately cessation of all the support, et cetera. If he doesn't do that, what basis does he have to negotiate something within 100 days that's going to be acceptable to all three of those parties?
Effectively nothing. I mean, the problem you have in the Trump camp is that everyone's running around saying, we need a win. We need a win in Ukraine. We have to have a win in the Middle East. We need a win in Ukraine. We need a win in the Middle East. Everything's about a win. Well, there's nothing to be won in Ukraine. There never was. We've dragged this war out. We're the cause of it. We installed this government in Kiev in 2014, and we've been subsidizing what is effectively an organized crime state. And all the people involved in this in the government are crooks. I feel badly for the Ukrainian people that have been misled by all of this and dragged into this abyss. But the truth is, we can't fix it. It's beyond our ability. And the Russians aren't going to trust anything we say. So we say, oh, well, we accept Ukrainian neutrality. All right, fine. Then they say, we want a comprehensive arrangement for security for Russia and for NATO and for the European people who border Russia. A perfectly legitimate ask in my judgment, but we don't want to grant that because that doesn't look like a win for us. Because what it means is that we stop interfering in other people's affairs in Eastern Europe. We get out of the area. We leave Ukraine. Oh, we can't do that. It'll look like we lost. We lost the day we decided to involve ourselves there.
We did. I think it's pretty evident to anyone who's willing to look at the reality of the situation, which we do frequently when we have you on the show here. In his testimony, I think it was yesterday, future Secretary of State Marco Rubio was asked a lot about the issue about the Ukraine war. Now, some of what he says here, I think, is an accurate depiction of the current situation, but then his provisions seem to be a little bit askance.
The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. The truth of the matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen. It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion, just given the size dynamic. Putin's goal now is to have maximum leverage so that he can basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so several things I want to ask you. Some of it I think is right in terms of especially the harm that's been done to the Ukraine side. But a couple of things he said there was important. One is he said that there is no way that Russia could take all of Ukraine. Do you agree with that, first of all?
Russia has never been interested in taking all of Ukraine. The war had nothing to do with any of the things that he and Bill Kristol, his mentor, and the other neocons are saying. This war was about the plight of the Russian people living inside Ukraine. That's where it started. That's what the Minsk Accords were about. And of course, we know that the Minsk Accords were just buying time for Ukraine to arm up for its war with Russia. So the first thing is the underlying assumptions are false. Now, could Russia march to the Polish border if it wanted to do so? Yes. There's no question about that. Russia doesn't want to do that. Russia doesn't want to rule the rest of Ukraine. Russia simply wants that part of Ukraine, whatever it turns out to be, west of the Dnieper River, I suspect, to be neutral on the Austrian or Finnish models, probably on the Austrian model. No foreign bases, no foreign forces, so that it poses no further threat to Russia. Russia has not fought this war to give anything away at the negotiating table that would result in a future conflict. And if you listen to Rubio, you listen to all of the neocons, they want this war to continue indefinitely. Everything is about a pause, if you will, followed by a resumption of war to destroy Russia and the evil state that it represents. So that's hopeless.
And then one of the other things you said in there was that, however incompetent the Russians may be, hard for me to really get my hand around that but it is a commonly held view that the Russians are incompetent, even though they completely thwarted an offensive attempt by Ukraine in 2023, and since that time has just been methodically grounding down the Ukrainian army and eating up territory. What do you say when you hear these people say stuff about the incompetence of the Russians?
It's the wholesale embrace of this mountain of lies designed to justify perpetual conflict against Russia. It is not in America's interest. The people who are pushing these things the hardest are not even Americans, in my judgment. These are people with backgrounds and connections that reach back over 100 years into the region. These people are fighting old agendas. They're resurrecting old anger, old hatreds in order to keep this thing going. So, Dan, there's nothing we can do. If President Trump refuses to reach beyond this very small universe of people that are misinforming him, and he's not going to listen to people that are going to tell him the truth, even though some of the truth did, as you point out, come out with even Rubio. But even there, the truth is misguided. The exchange rate in terms of deaths and casualties is somewhere between 1 to 6 and 1 to 8, with for every one Russian, 6, 7, or 8 Ukrainians have been killed or wounded. I mean, it's that simple, and it's getting worse with each passing day. It's been disastrous for the last several months because the Ukrainian force is collapsing. And when armies collapse, they take heavy casualties while they're trying to retreat, withdraw, or escape destruction. And that's what's happening in Ukraine.
And so you just described something that matches what we can physically see on the battlefield. We can watch the line moving to the west. So what you said lines up with what we observe. But here's what some other people are saying that is rather contradictory to what we observe on there. And yet the microphones keep getting put in the faces of guys like Ben Hodges.
Putin, on the other hand, much weaker now than he was a year ago. The obvious hundreds of thousands of casualties, lost equipment. The Russian defense industry is in the toilet, and they lost their Syrian ally, Bashar al-Assad. Russia did not even have the capacity to save Assad and keep doing what they're doing in Ukraine. I think the Trump team sees this, and that maybe their own calculation is changing about how they interact with Putin.
I just almost don't even know what to say. Why this guy keeps saying stuff like that when everything on the ground is the opposite?
It's he's on the payroll. I mean, he I don't know if he's still at this SIPA organization that is, virulently anti-Russian, and the people that own that and finance it are equally anti-Russian. So he's being paid handsomely to say those things, and there's no accountability for any of the lying. None. I mean, that's the biggest problem in Washington. Somebody said to me the other day, we're dealing with state-sponsored media in the United States. And then another person said, not really. We just have billionaire-sponsored media. In other words, billionaires own the government. Billionaires are setting the policy. Billionaires are telling the lies, and everybody is supposed to believe it. It just simply comes through the media that people used to think was capable of telling the truth. It isn't now. There's no truth. They're just narratives. He's part of the narrative. It's enriched him. It keeps him flush in cash. He's going to continue that to the bitter end, unless there is accountability. I don't see any evidence that there will be in the short term.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not. But that's the kind of thing that one of the problems with the mainstream media is because those guys like him keep getting the talking points and getting to go in front of the camera. Jumping back to Rubio here, now that he's going to, in the next segment here, he's going to talk about what Trump is going to do. So he first laid out what he views as the circumstance on the ground, and then he was asked, what is Trump going to do about it? And so
the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like it's going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor, but it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire And we're going to have, there are going to, in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage.
And do you think that both sides have leverage? Does the United States and Trump have leverage?
No, we have no leverage at all. We have worked ourselves into a position where threats of sanctions, threats of action, all of those have fallen on deaf ears now. I don't think anybody in Moscow pays any attention to anything we say anymore. Well, I think they do, at least insofar as they continue to worry about our readiness to potentially use nuclear weapons against them. Yes, and they're worried about that. But beyond that, no, I don't think so. Here's the problem with Rubio's entire approach. All the governments in Europe, the major governments certainly, France, Germany, Italy, I think eventually Great Britain, though it doesn't look that way today, all of these governments are going to fall into the hands of nationalists. And Rubio and his friends and backers are going to be horrified, claiming that Europe has become a Nazi movement or something, which is just crap. Nationalists don't want to be dragged into wars and see their countries destroyed needlessly. People who are not nationalists, who are internationalists, globalists, Rubio is clearly one of those, are not worried about those things. Those countries just contain people who are fungible commodities. How many have to be sacrificed for the greater good of changing the world to suit them and their so-called rules-based order is all that counts. But he doesn't understand that these governments are coming to a climax. You're going to see it in Germany. You're going to see it in France. People are going to watch a government come to power, and then they're going to say, well, that's not so bad. And they're wrong. It's still somewhat globalist in its orientation. It's not going to last. This process is going to continue until nationalist governments replace everything that's out there. If you look at Tusk in Poland, he's hanging on by his fingernails. Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, these are already nationalist governments. Austria is a nationalist government now. Everybody is saying, what is in our interest? The EU does not act on our behalf. The EU is part of the problem. NATO is entangling us in wars we don't want to fight. Everything that Rubio takes for granted assumes, the key assumptions being that nothing really has changed, are false. It's all wrong. And at some point, these governments are going to say, thank you very much, get out. We're not interested in fighting in your war. Well, you know, it's already true. People in Poland are always saying, listen, we don't want to die for Ukraine. We don't even like the Ukrainians. So the problem is this is all going to go away. He's going to have no influence, and Trump will have no influence. The best thing that he can do is read the tea leaves, do the things we discussed at the beginning, and then say, I am happy to host a peace conference where the states that border Russia and the Russians and Ukrainians can all sit down to work out their differences and come up with a solution. Instead, he is acting as though we have to provide the solution. Not only have to provide it, we must impose it. We can't. Those days are over. This is a new world now. The Russians aren't going to put up with it. Nobody else in the BRICS community will, and increasingly that's going to be true for Europe.
Yeah, you mentioned at the start of this that the incoming administration and all the people that are working for Trump are trying to get a win out of this and put a good face on it. And I think Rubio's trying to thread that needle by, admitting that Ukraine's never going to win back its territory and they're going to have to make concessions, et cetera. But then he tries to have it kind of both ways by saying, and the Russians are also going to have to give up some things in order, he said, to get a ceasefire. That's apparently what he thinks is going to start this process. But to your point a minute ago about what the Russians think and say, they're saying, yeah, that's a no-go.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere.
And certainly it is, because Russia doesn't need a truce. Russia doesn't need a ceasefire. They're winning already on the battlefield, and their manpower, they continue to restock the kitty every day, every month. They actually bring in somewhere around 1,000 recruits per day. And I don't know what their casualty rates is, but it's less than that. So they're able to continue to grow their forces, whereas, of course, it's shrinking on the Ukraine side. So if Rubio's thinking that we're going to try to get a ceasefire to start the process, I think the battlefield is going to have a different outcome.
Oh, absolutely. He's King Lear in the storm raging at the weather. It's a waste of time. It's going to go nowhere. But again, you're correct. Everybody thinks that there's got to be a win. Nixon and Kissinger were trying to construct something that could be billed as a win. Well, the only win for the United States was to get out of Vietnam. Everything else was lost. And one can argue that everything was lost there on the first day because we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't even know where to go, what to do, whom to attack. And this continued for years. So we're in a very similar position now. The win for us is extricating ourselves from this tar baby. Get out, say goodbye, move on. I think that's what will eventually happen, because I'm afraid President Trump is surrounded by people that will prevent him from doing what makes sense, which is what we just discussed earlier. Offer to host something, but otherwise announce we're leaving, we're out, it's over, we're not going to do this anymore, which would make infinite sense. And it would be a big win here in the United States.
Well, that's actually what I was about to say. It depends on your definition of win. If it's something classic, that's not even on the table. But what you described is some creative thinking that actually says, hey, there is a way that you can come out with a win. Now, of course, his political enemies will be against it no matter what, because the Biden administration on its way out the door has gone to extreme lengths at the president, the Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense to all say they have set up Ukraine to stand on its own, and only Trump undermining that can potentially lose it. So if he did what you suggested, that's what they would say to him. But I think that there's a lot of plausibility to say he's not going to win those people over anyway. So just forget about that. This is what makes sense, and the people who elected him to be president would love it, I believe.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Back in 2005, I remember having a conversation with several people, and I said, we just need to leave Iraq. You know, you got Saddam Hussein. What are we doing here? Let's just get out. And everybody said the same thing. Oh, we can't just leave. And, my answer was, well, that's what we're going to do anyway, because we don't live there. It's not Kansas. It's not Missouri. So I think, it would be useful if somebody sat down with President Trump, if he would listen, provide him with some truth instead of lies about the great Ukrainian success story, point to the absolutely systemic corruption, and say it's time for us to get out of this thing. We can't fix it. We don't want to rule it. We don't want to pay for it. We're out. But we'll be happy to host a conference. And the Russians would take that as a very positive development, because they're tired of us trying to impose things on them. And we don't want war with Russia. You see, this is the other problem. Everybody is promoting hostility to Russia in Washington. But we don't need it. We don't want it. There's no reason for it. But you have this phony dichotomy. You have the democratic states on one side and the authoritarians on the other. I mean, it's a false dichotomy. It makes no sense at all. But that's the sort of lie that continues to be promoted. That's General Hodges and everybody like him.
And, one of the other, I guess, enduring and popular lies that has also continued on throughout this is the claim that Zelensky makes this all the time. And I think Jack Keane has lifted this up, and certainly a number of others, that says, hey, the Russian is out to get you. If he gets Ukraine, he is definitely going to go to the West, and he's going to conquer everybody because he wants to recreate the Soviet Union, et cetera. You mentioned something at the beginning of this, and Lavrov actually yesterday at a press conference addressed some of that they are focused not on conquering land in the West. They are focused on protecting the ethnic Russians in the eastern part of what was Ukraine.
The return of Donald Trump has fueled speculation of a peace deal in Ukraine. Is he the master deal maker he claims to be? And how far is Russia willing to go? What concessions are you willing to make to reach an agreement?
Neither the narrative nor anyone's discourse has addressed the rights of Russians, whose language, whose culture, education, media, and whose canonical religion were banned by law in Ukraine. There will be no serious conversations if the West pretends that this is normal. And when the outgoing administration in the person of Blinken and Sullivan says that they are confident that the new White House will continue the policy of supporting Ukraine, is this a testament to exterminate everything Russian as before?
Now, so people can understand what he's talking about. He's not just talking about the ethnic Russians on the Russian side of the line of contact here, but the apparently the minimum that Putin will settle for is all four of the oblasts that they annex, and that includes all of this gray area right here, which is still fully controlled by the Ukraine side. So what Lavrov and Putin have said is that the entry point for negotiations is this line right here, which means that the Ukraine side would have to literally withdraw from that position here, because he said he's not going to have the line here because all of the ethnic Russians that still live here, and actually you can go into Odessa and Kharkiv City, there's quite a lot in there too. And that's what animated them to make the what they called a special military operation in the first place, is the needs of the ethnic Russians over here. So if it's not going into the West, but it's here, it seems to me, again, to your point that you made earlier, that this is something that the Western side and possibly the Trump people here are misunderstanding about what the objectives are of the Russians. So it's hard to come up with a negotiated settlement if you don't know what the Russians are really after. And I can't hear you, Doug. Gary, can you hear? I don't hear Doug right now.
Doug, can you turn your microphone back on for us?
Here we go.
When the Russians intervened in eastern Ukraine initially, the argument was, well, the Russian army is too small. It's not well enough equipped. It's not sufficiently trained. And they're losing to the Ukrainians, who are so much better. Well, if your plan was always to reconquer everything that we call the Warsaw Pact, then you would have thought that the army was overly large, very lethal, and ready to march west at hypersonic speed. Well, that wasn't the case. So how do you then say now he's ready to march west? Well, Russia has done what it has to do to defend itself and to defend its people inside eastern Ukraine. If they were really committed to this massive offensive, would they have waited this long? Would they have exercised as much restraint as they have, particularly in the face of these long-range strike weapons that we've given to the Ukrainians that have harmed people inside Russia proper? Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't pass the smell test. It's all nonsense. But one would think at this point it would be a huge mistake to underestimate Russian resolve to secure itself. And if you leave them no alternative to march further west, they'll do it. So at this point, it would make infinite sense to hold that conference we discussed and come to some sort of arrangement.
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say, or what I was going to ask. If Trump goes by what the Kellogg and the Rubio plan seems to be, which is try to freeze the contact on the current lines here and just give up whatever Russia has taken so far, if they're not willing to look at the people and the rest of the ethnic Russians that are on the other side of that line right now, or Putin's 14 June lines, which we just showed you on the map right there. If Trump doesn't have a negotiation with that, what is the Russian alternative? What will they do instead?
They'll continue to advance to the west until they have advanced to, I think, ultimately the Dnieper River, because that at least provides them with a natural barrier. And that historically, if you go back and look at maps from, say, 1400 forward, most of the time that river was the boundary between what we call the West and the East. Beyond the Dnieper, there were some Russians, but there were a lot of Mongols and a lot of Tartars and Turks. And Kiev, when it fell into Russian hands, had been a Lithuanian-Polish fortress designed to protect the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation. We can go back over this forever, but the point is that that would be feasible. I mean, if I were sitting on the Russian general staff, that would be my recommendation. Let's at least secure the river line. That gives us a natural defense, gives us a buffer in the event that we have to fight again in the future. But I think the Russians don't want to fight again in the future. They would like to put an end to this, but to do that, they need everybody to sign on for a solution. We are not advocating a solution. We're advocating obstruction that'll prevent any solution because we refuse to listen to anything the Russians say and take it seriously.
To what extent do you think the prospect or the possibility that when Putin set those 14 June lines, which apparently are still the minimum discussion, all that area I just showed you, that they said that because they believe that that Trump won't be able to agree to that he won't be able to negotiate away land that Ukraine hasn't lost in war. And so Trump won't agree to that. And then that provides the pretext for Moscow to go all the way to the Dnieper, i.e. that's actually their operational plan right now. They intend to go to the Dnieper River.
I'm not on distribution for this sort of thing from the Russian general staff. I don't know. I would put myself in that position and I would reach that kind of conclusion. I mean, how did the Rio Grande become our border with Mexico? If you go back and look at the discussions that were held in 1846, 47, that was a natural barrier. And it seemed to make sense because we knew that we could never incorporate the people south of the Rio Grande into the United States. There were only about 115,000 human beings in the entire area that we annexed and made part of the United States. We rapidly flooded those areas with millions of people that we call Americans. But we couldn't do that with Mexico. So I imagine that there's a similar thought process. And the other thing is that our span of attention, Dan, as you know, is very short. We're the microwave country. We want to put it in the microwave and out comes the answer. We want a solution. There's no willingness to look at the long haul under any circumstances. And it's back to the win. Where's the win? How do we get a win out of this? So, at the end of the day, I think this whole thing will be decided in the region by the Russians and ultimately, eventually, by Europeans who have said enough. We're not interested in this war. We don't want to fight it.
Well, in the last few minutes we have here, speaking of the Europeans, I just want your analysis, I guess, of what's really going on, what they intend and what's going on behind the scenes, because you have France and the UK here in the last 24 hours have again broached this idea that, hey, whatever Trump ends up doing negotiating, I think it would be really cool if we brought French and UK soldiers, not NATO, but France and UK soldiers to peacekeepers to come in and patrol the end of that. What do you say to that prospect?
It's absurd. And I would say let them try it, because I think they're going to face enormous opposition inside their own countries, saying, what are British soldiers doing in the middle of Ukraine? Why are we there? This doesn't make any sense. Same thing with the French. What are they doing? What are they going to do? Garrison, Crimea? That's absurd. The Russians will just laugh at this and basically make it clear, if you come into Ukraine, we will destroy you. And if you look at the armies that you have right now in Great Britain and France, these are what I call boutique armies. These are designed for very limited, low-level, low-intensity operations. None of these people are prepared for the Russians. So the notion that the Russians would sign on for something like that is absurd. So I think they've got problems at home and they got problems with Moscow. It's not going to happen.
So there may be some fantasy hopes for it, but I mean, just because of what you talked about, the balance of military power between the two sides, Russia would never agree to that because they have no incentive to agree to that. Why would they?
No, it's absurd. It would be absurd for us. I mean, look at our army. It's in no way prepared to deal with a Russian military establishment. And my God, the logistical constraints on these operations and the cost, it's absurd.
But Doug, help me understand something here. What is the thought process behind the authorities in the UK and in France to even, because it seems to me that they actually believe that that's a theoretical possibility, that somehow it would do something. But it takes about a second lieutenant level of analysis to just look at this and say, well, as you said, absurd. And yet here is the president and the prime minister of those two countries actually advocating this. Why would they do that?
Well, you have the leaders in both countries that don't want to be embarrassed by the truth. And the truth is that they've signed on for a catastrophe with us. Starmer is on very thin ice. He's going to end up like Liz Truss here very shortly, I suspect. I don't know who comes in next, but eventually you're going to get British nationalists. They're going to say, this is crazy. We want out. The same thing is going to happen to Macron and the group that's currently running the show in Paris. They're not going to last. You may have an out-and-out revolution in Paris, and that would sweep across Europe. You know, the old saying is, every time Paris sneezes, Europe gets a cold. I think that's eminently possible. Germany is a pre-revolutionary state, but the Germans, of course, are very stalwart believers in the rule of law. They're going to stand back to the last possible moment, but the French won't. I think you might see more immediate violence and uprising in France. But the point is, none of it's doable. And the generals that run these forces privately know that. But if you're one of the top generals, you're probably there because you were willing to go along with stupidity anyway. And you assume, oh, well, this will never happen, so I'll say it. I mean, I've had these conversations with people in the U.S. Army, too. Generals said, well, that'll never happen anyway, so what does it hurt to say that? I've heard people say those things. It's a serious mistake.
Well, without question, it is. Last question I want to ask is, we'll zoom back to the United States here and Trump in particular. If he listens to the likes of Kellogg and Rubio and some of these others who are quasi looking at the truth and thinks that he's going to get some kind of a positive outcome besides the one that you laid out there, which is absolutely wide open and could be accomplished, what would Trump do if he starts to go down the path that Kellogg is laying out, only to discover that Russia won't play? Because he's going to then be in a position to where, well, I tried to get X, but now X has been taken away from me. So does he then be seen as capitulating to Russia, then doing what you suggested, or will he face the risk of trying to escalate the situation to try and force Russia into something he wants? So I think that's a big danger.
Well, that is a danger. The only thing I can say is that my limited exposure to President Trump is that this is not someone who wants a war with anyone. He's actually very interested in peace and stability. He understands that we've got huge problems inside our country. He wants to deal with those. He wants to secure the border. He wants to reverse the migration. He wants to stabilize the United States. He wants prosperity here. You go down this road, you can throw all of that into the trash. It's never going to happen. So I think President Trump's instincts are good. Now, you're saying, what if he listens? Well, you have a lot of people. I call this class in Washington the stupids. The stupids believe, well, President Trump could go do a deal with Putin, and that deal will be he can do what he wants with Ukraine and give us a free hand in the Middle East so we can reshape it to Israel's advantage. I don't think so. But there are a lot of dumb people out there that think in those terms. Well, we'll give the Russians a bone here, but then they've got to do business with us somewhere else. No, they don't. And that's why this assumption that the Middle East is easier to solve is very, very wrong. Very wrong. That's one of the most complex and difficult regions in the entire world. And the notion that we can somehow or another clean up the battlefield and put out the fires that the arsonist Netanyahu has set is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, and I think we're going to find out about that. Well, listen, we certainly hope that that's exactly the way it turns out, that Trump recognizes that before he gets into that situation there, because the course of action that you laid out there really is the only one that I see is plausible, given all of the ground truth realities, diplomatic, military, and political, that he could take. And then that benefits him. That allows him to pivot over to all those things you just mentioned, which are actually in his power to do something positive with for the United States. And I certainly hope that he gets that's done there. But before we let you go, anything new going on in our country, our choice world that you want to let us know about?
Yeah, actually there is. We've now published a 5-point program where we're going to concentrate all of our effort, all of our resources. And those 5 points are very simple, but I think they make a lot of sense. The goal is the same. We want to replace most of the people in Washington with people that are actually interested in the United States and will represent the interests of the American people. And that mechanism is a movement, a third movement that ultimately could become a third political force. But in the meantime, we want to make America secure, and that means putting an end to these overseas interventions along the lines we were discussing and focusing on the border, our littoral waters, and securing our population. Second is make America safe. That means destroy the criminality, this wave of criminal activity that comes with drugs and open borders, and then reverse that to the extent that we're able. Then make America prosperous, which is to start focusing not so much on fighting the rest of the world and punishing the rest of the world with tariffs on everything in sight, but to look at what we can do here at home and take trade as it comes and try to make it mutually beneficial. And then also to look at making America healthy. And this is something that RFK Jr. talked about that I think is very important. We have a very unhealthy population right now. You know that. We know that from the experience of recruiting for the military. And then finally, make America smarter. And that means we've got to change the way we educate people, make education a path to employment. And that's our country, our choice is focused there. We're partnering with a lot of great organizations. We think it can happen. And we think that Donald Trump can actually play a very leading role in all of that if he wants to. But, you know, we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And we hope for the best. And we're going to give this president a chance and support him to the extent that we can.
Well, man, who's to argue with any of those points? Those are great. I would love it if he adopted all 5 of them, because that would actually benefit the United States instead of going down these rat holes that just nothing but cost us everything. So I appreciate you doing that. And we invite people to go to our country, our choice. Gary had it up on the screen there a second ago, and find out more about that. We appreciate it.
Okay, we'll be in touch. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks a lot, Doug. We appreciate it. Also appreciate you guys. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. That makes more, that helps us out a lot more than you may think that it does. Also to let you know, here at, I believe it's 3:00 this afternoon, Eastern time, we're going to have the ever wonderful and delightful Alex Mercurius of the Durand's going to be on the show. He's going to talk about NATO preparing for war with Russia. I didn't get into that too much with Doug here, but there's some comments that have been out by the new Secretary General Mark Rutte about getting ready for war with Russia. I mean, if you think that's crazy, just tune in to find out more what Alexander has to say about that. We'll see you at that time on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.